Boardroom Bound, Episode 26, How to Secure 18 Board Roles in 20 Years, with Julie Garland McLellan.
It's really all about understanding your brand and what they will say about you when you're not there, and then working very much to your strengths.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give new and aspiring directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's episode, we'll be speaking with Julie Garland McLellan. And this is someone with a vast amount of board experience. She's been on approximately 18 boards over about 20 years. And not only has she grown her board career, she now teaches on the subject. So she teaches it for an accrediting institution. She gives public speeches. She meets in private board settings. This is someone that we can learn from, and both from her experience of how she started in her career, which she said began by luck, and then intentionally moving to the nonprofit space, and then to a government entity, and then into a private board role, and then a public board role, and eventually built that reputation and authority. And now as she teaches on the subject, she'll also be sharing with some of the best practices that she's learned, such as how you set apart a good director from, say, the mediocre masses, and the role of the professional director institutions in getting the accreditation that you need. So much to cover that's very actionable for all of us today. Julie breaks it down really well. But before we start today's episode, I'd like to share with you the exciting news that this podcast has been nominated for the People's Choice Podcast Awards. This is the 14th annual running. They've been honoring podcasts since 2005, and I can't tell you how pleased and tickled I am to think that this little podcast we started in February is now gaining notoriety to be included with such luminaries as Freakonomics or NPR Planet Money, which has won it 3 times. So this is a big event, and I'm really proud just to be a part of it. The Academy Awards, I always talk about, it's a treat just to be honored, and I do actually feel that way, but I'd be even more honored if we were one of the finalists. And the way that you get to become a finalist is through voting. So voting happens during July. We will have 5 podcast episodes in July, and in all of those, I will have a link so that if you feel so inclined, you can click on it and go in and vote. And I'm thrilled that we're included as part of it, and I would love to have as many of our listeners as possible to go and to be voting in the program as well. So tune in for July. We'll have a link to the show notes. And after that brief side pause, let's really jump into today's show. Julie Garland McLellan, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Thank you.
Delighted to have you joining us from the other side of the world in Australia. This is exactly the beauty of the technology that we have today, that we can bring your expertise into our studio here and then pass it out to all of our listeners around the world. So thrilled to be sharing your background and expertise, which is incredibly impressive. If someone looked at your LinkedIn profile, they would think this is probably the person I need on my board today. But of course, you had to build up to that and get there. Let's just set the scene a little bit for our audience, right? So you've served on something in the order of 18 boards over 20 or so years, which is incredibly impressive. That didn't happen overnight. Perhaps you can just start us off on the story about how that journey began.
Like many people who work in large multinational companies, my first board seat happened by accident. So I was put in charge of an international office. My first day in the office, there were a lot of official papers to sign, and one of them was a consent to act as a director form, which I noticed said resident director. And I was just about to change it and say, no, I'm actually the regional manager for Spain and the Iberian Peninsula. And the accountant said, no, you can't. You're a director of the local company, and it's very important that you're the resident director because we have to have one. And I said, well, that's not what's on my CV, that's not what's on my business cards. And he said, no, but that's what we need because if anything goes wrong here, you go to prison here.
Good start.
And we must have one. And so my first start with directorship was a really clear understanding of, oh my gosh, my judgment puts this company as something that the authorities will allow or not allow. And then the second thing was that at the time, I mean, this was back in the 1980s, and Colonel Oliver North was a bit of a hero around the world because he had signed instructions for everything he did, even though those things were patently wrong.
Right.
And so I said, well, my co-directors are my boss and his boss, who's the chairman. If I just do what they say and they tell me in writing, I'll be okay, won't I? And the accountant said, no, you're a director. It's your judgment, not theirs. And they're not here, and you are. And so suddenly I had to learn about transfer pricing and international tax and thin capitalization, as well as all of the local laws and rules about employment and capital structures and environmental practices, which once you knew about it and learned about it was very interesting. But the thing I found most amazing was that my boss and his boss, I was the first director they'd ever appointed who'd done more than just sign what the accountant gave them. And so I was sitting in Spain reading everything I could about how to be a company director and insisting that my boss and his boss act like proper company directors, and we have phone calls and talk about the company and make proper decisions as a group and keep minutes of those decisions, which they both enjoyed and benefited from. So the whole thing was a very positive experience after a somewhat frightening start. But I loved the idea of the group decision-making, the strategic focus, the power of those different insights and perspectives. So I knew that I loved being on a board and wanted to do more of it. So when I left Spain, I just made sure that I really studied hard and got all of the relevant qualifications for directors, and then pushed on and made a big effort to get the career started. So after that one, then it was very deliberate, some not-for-profits of the variety that have serving board members on their boards and that operate in the same way as a commercial company, from there into some government sector boards, and from those into the commercial sector, where now I've chaired listed companies, I've done a listed company turnaround. It's good fun. And I still love that group decision-making.
Well, this is a great case study, and this will pick up on a lot of the expertise that you share with others today, because you deliver training, you deliver speeches all about the boardroom. So you had that first experience, you thought, this is exactly what I want to do. But let's break it down. So you talked about, and we discussed this on this show, sometimes different paths to take. Some people take what you talked about. You go to a nonprofit, you get a good experience, you build some networking, that will lead to the others. Was that where you started with your board seat number 2?
Yes, it was. So my second board seat was very carefully picked. It was the foundation of the local the best local university's engineering faculty. I hadn't studied at that university because I'd studied overseas in England. But I was an engineer, I was female, and I had done an MBA at a Spanish university. And so when I went to them and said, look, I'm really interested in the foundation, I'm interested in the work you do to help engineers who otherwise would not be able to complete their studies. I've just come from Spain, I've done an MBA, I understand as a participant what a really good alumni program looks like and the sort of money it should generate, and I can see what you've got, and I really think I could perhaps help. So very targeted, very strategic, and very much looking at it from the point of view of, this is what I would like to bring to your board, not from the point of view of, I want to be a director, can I join your board?
Mm-hmm. And this will touch on a larger topic that I'm sure will be a motif in this conversation. That was branding, right? You were building your specialist expertise and matching it with their needs, right?
It was. One of my friends who's a marketing person often says, your brand isn't what you say it is, it's what they say it is when you're not there.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a really good... So, in fact, one of my pieces of advice is there's a very old Harvard Business Review paper by Tom Peters, A Brand Called You. And it's all about what are you known for? Are you the person who puts their hand up when there's more work? Are you the person who's very diligent? Are you the person who has the flashes of inspiration? But it's really all about understanding your brand and what they will say about you when you're not there, and then working very much to your strength. So I would recommend that all aspiring directors read that paper, and also that they read some of the work on strength-based leadership.
Well, so Julie, transition this for us. So you've now been very intentional about joining some great nonprofit boards, and at some point you clearly wanted paid corporate board roles. How did you make that segment switch?
I made that switch by, again, looking at my engineering qualifications, looking at my water qualifications. The government had recently restructured, as they often will, their holdings in the water utility sector where I was based. They'd done that because they had a series of governance issues that they wished to address. And so I, again, made a very strong application and said, look, I've worked at Thames Water. I was part of the privatization team. This is how many billion we raised. I understand that this is not a privatization candidate, but I believe my engineering insights, my board knowledge, my formal qualifications, my experience would add value to this board and allow you as a government to say this really is a board that can take this company forwards. And here's how I sit with the other board members on this board. At the moment, I understand one comes off for me to come on, but there's no overlap, so I'm an easy candidate for you to appoint.
And so that was not only knowing your own branding, but that was also knowing the board, right, and how you'd fit in. That's perfect.
Yes. So you have to read, I would read the annual report, every page on the website, the news, Glassdoor, Rotten Tomatoes. Read everything you can about the company, and particularly the bits that will interest you are the bits that are already playing to your strengths. So when you read about the company's HR policies, if you've got an HR background, they'll be the bits that you're excited about. So the reading shouldn't be a hardship, but it's that question of knowing exactly what you want and why. Now, I sent that letter into the department and into the minister's office, and nothing. No response at all. But one of my not-for-profits was, by this stage, was the Chamber of Mines. And so when I had a chance and the minister was just relaxing over a coffee after having some official function with us, I said to, and we had a female mining minister back then, I said to her, look, I sent this letter to your colleague and also to the department, and I didn't hear anything, not even a thank you, but no thanks. And she said, well, I've got 2 words of advice, Julie. Keep trying. And she said, that's the advice I give everybody, and it's the only advice I know that works. So I took heart, and I waited until 6 months before the next board refreshment period came around, and I dug out the letter, simply changed it to say, on this date, some directors will be up for re-election. You might want to consider me, and back into my prepared text. And by return email, I got a letter saying, you've been appointed. And that was $30,000 a year. Plus, it was a company where I knew what value I would add. I knew who I would be working with. It was, as a government board, it was one of the easiest and best ways in. I mean, sometimes governments will appoint 6 new directors all at once and not tell anybody who else is being appointed with them. I do know of one board where they appointed a pair of ex-husband and wife to the same board.
Sure, that was interesting cultural dynamic
on their
shift.
CVs. Yeah. Yes, I can understand that the spreadsheet might have said that they'd work well together, but dynamically interesting. So from there, now I had a group of people who knew me from my not-for-profit, and my not-for-profits were very much the not-for-profits that interested me as an engineer, and were therefore useful to me. So I had the Chamber of Mines, I had the engineering school, and I had the Mining and Energy Council, which was another industry lobby body. So I was starting to head into the territory of becoming a bit of a specialist on members' professional associations, which of course I then later leveraged and stood for election to the Australian Institute of Company Directors Council and was elected on my very first attempt because my little manifesto was attractive to the members and my experience looked good and relevant. So it is, I would say, do not, sometimes people say, make a nice CV, make a nice cover letter, send it to 100 company chairmen, see what happens. I would advise against that. I prefer a rifle shot to a machine gun spray.
Yeah, it sounds like you've had more of a sniper approach rather than a shotgun blast. And I think the surgical approach, where you have a very clear brand and a very precise way of spending your time and energy, which takes a lot, is, I would think, a great way to yield good results. And, we should also transition from there, from you becoming a paid board director, building a portfolio around that, which we can all imagine how that's grown and developed. But you've now grown, I would say, almost beyond that. That is a part of who you are. But now you're also a coach, an educator, a speaker in this space. How have you grown to be that sort of leading authority voice out there?
I guess, again, it started, and I'm a great believer in luck is preparation meeting opportunity. So I'm a great believer in luck, and I'm a great believer in taking it when it's there. So when people say, oh, yes, I was an overnight success, yeah, but I worked 20 years to be there on that night. So people often mistake luck as just pure happenstance. But you've got to be ready to take advantage of the things that happen. And the only way you're going to get ready without it being some horrible grind for the whole of your life is to really focus on the things that you like and you enjoy. And as you get older and go through life, you will find that these things become clearer to you. So I had returned to Australia. Well, I'd come to Australia after finishing my roles in Spain. I joined BHP. I was a strategic planner, and the first thing I did was say, right, I want some proper director education from some proper directors, because the one thing I got from my boss and his boss was, Julie, this is all theoretical. So I went to the Institute of Company Directors. I did their diploma course, and then I did their advanced diploma course, and I did several of their short courses. And they said, well, look, you're qualified, you obviously have a passion for this, you can talk, as podcast readers will be working out by now. Why don't you come and help us by teaching this course? So I did, and I discovered that, yes, when I'm talking about things I love, I wouldn't say I can teach, but I can help people to learn, which is a good deal more useful.
Now, so let's pick up on that as example, right? So I know one of the things you teach is the Foundations of Directorship course and several other more advanced ones. And you've probably had a sense from seeing that, as well as teaching the material and seeing your audience, about what's going to separate a good director from, say, the mediocre masses.
I think the good director, firstly, never approaches a problem from the point of view of, I know what I'm doing, this is the answer. They will appoint it from, I think I know what I'm doing. I think the answer's in this area. But let me hear what everybody else has got. So the best directors, on the one hand, they are very independent, but they are very good listeners, very good team members, and once a decision's taken, they really support the decision, even if they argued against it at the time. So that's one thing. The other thing is they ask the most insightful questions.
Now, I remember when I was in the UK, and they have this great term I love. It's called Noddy. You could ask the Noddy question. So I imagine being a new board member, and it's not as simple as the kids' why. It's a more probing, constructive, understanding question below it about, why do we do these things this way in this company when I've seen success in a different way elsewhere? So you're adding value by adding good and hard questions. Is that the example of what you're talking about?
Yes, and open-ended questions, and questions that encourage management to think about things and to create things. So it's those questions that make you stop and go, ooh. Somebody in one of my boards recently, we were talking about the staff engagement survey, which is huge, and it's delivered online, and it's got all these questions, and you have to tick the answers, and if you haven't answered them all, you can't move to the next page, and if you haven't done it within a certain time, it starts to pop up in your email and interfere with your computer use until you do it. And this director stopped and said to the HR manager, do you think our collection of data is actually impacting the culture that we are seeking to measure information on? And the HR director looked at it, and of course I immediately sat up and said, oh, Schrodinger's cat. But it was very, very interesting, because we then recognized that we weren't actually treating our staff as fully functioning human beings. We were treating them as people who had to be forced and coerced, and we were asking far too many questions, the answers to which we weren't particularly interested in. And so we took our survey from 100 plus questions down to 5. And then we provided empty text boxes underneath those 5 for staff to say what they wanted to say. And we asked them for examples of where is our culture being lived and demonstrated by the people around you. And are there any examples of our culture not being lived and demonstrated? And we got much more valuable information. But the culture itself was reinforced by the survey rather than just turning up with the usual answers because the staff could look at the questions and work out what we wanted them to tick.
That's a great example.
And if you train people to not take something seriously, then that's what they learn to do. So actually making sure that we really train them in the things we want them to do and do again and again, very important to us.
And just picking up on that thread and taking it slightly different direction. So we've talked about the Australian Institute for Company Directors and the Institute and the great work that they do and the education they share with others. How would you describe the role for our audience in terms of a professional director's institution and what it can mean for them as they pursue their board career?
Now, a lot of people will say, oh, why do I need that? I've been a senior executive in these wonderful companies, or I've founded these companies and I've grown them and I'm being invited onto boards. And people want me for my practical knowledge, not for this governance stuff, this ticking of boxes and checking of things that must be checked. And my response is, you don't know what you don't know. So one of the reasons that, for example, the NACD or the Institute of Directors in England, Canada, or India, the Center for Corporate Governance and Sustainability in Muscat, the Corporate Governance Institute in Dubai, all of these different places are places where, first of all, you will meet and network with other directors who will then know you and what you can bring and be in a position to speak for you. They won't speak very loudly, but if your name comes up in a selection process, they'll say, oh, yeah, I know that person. I met that person at this place. And this is a professional place to have met somebody, and it shows that they're taking a professional interest in their director career, which can only be a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
You will never get hired because you have done your chartered director course. But you will get hired because when they were looking at two different people, you were the one who'd done the chartered director course and seemed to be fully aware of your responsibilities and duties, as well as bringing whatever it is you bring.
It's an easy tiebreaker, right?
It's a very easy tiebreaker, and it's also, I find from time to time, particularly when I was younger, not so much now, although it does occasionally help, that I'd be sitting there at the table and I'd be thinking, this person is a former chairman of Rio Tinto. And he says this, and I'm not sure I agree. Oh my goodness. I'm just me, and he's a godly figure in our industry. So to actually sit there and say, well, hang on, the reason I believe this is this, this, and this, and there are certificates on my wall that aren't on his. Not to then be brazen about it, but to respectfully ask the questions, have we considered the governance implications? Have we considered the legal implications? Have we considered the position that we are placing the board members of our joint venture subsidiary into because of these duties that they will have? It's really quite important to know these things and be able to ask these questions, and you won't know until you find out.
Mm-hmm.
So I advise very much, never stop learning, always be learning something new. But I would advise very strongly have some formal director learning as well as your career experience and your learnings from that to bring together as a package.
That makes sense. I was going to say that makes total sense to me, right? So I do believe that leaders are readers, and I think that's an important part of this and something we advocate for our audience. And I know not only do you read, but you've written 6 books yourself, and we can have links to them in the show notes. But if you were suggesting to our audience that this is the sort of field you want to go down, this is what you want to pick up, which of yours would you say would be the right starting point?
Well, it depends on where you are at the moment. That terrible joke about the man who asks the red-necked peasant, "Excuse me, sir, I'm lost," and the peasant says, "Well, if that's where you're going, you shouldn't be starting from here," which I always find very amusing, because you've all got to start from somewhere, and the Earth's the sphere, so wherever you start from, you could get to any other place quite easily. But when we really look and say, which book's going to help? Well, if you're on a not-for-profit board, then obviously the not-for-profit board dilemmas book, which will help you scramble up the experience curve at a speed far higher than anyone else will be expecting. If you're on a for-profit board, or if you've enjoyed that book, then just the the Dilemmas books, which have commercial and government boards in them as well. If you're in a government board and you're very serious about it, the All Above Board, which is the specific one for government sector governance. And again, I joined my government board and discovered immediately that everything I'd learned at the Institute of Company Directors was completely wrong, because there was a minister and there were political imperatives.
Sure.
And there was this requirement to balance social, environmental, and economic impacts. And economic impacts were felt across the economy, not just in our profit and loss. And so I had to pull my blinkers off pretty quickly and start really considering this company in a very different form. And I kept asking people, well, where's the book? And there wasn't one. But by the time I'd got through 3 years of being on this board, I had this long list of questions and a few answers that I'd been able to research, which I then rounded out by going and asking people who were successful directors in the area, if you think back to when you started on a government board, what did you learn that you wish you could have learnt before you got there? Mm-hmm. And then I'd ask people in the department, when you appoint a new director, what do you wish they knew that they always seem to stumble across learning in their first few years? And the book just was very easy to write. So there's that one as well. And if you are a senior executive and you're looking to attract the attention of the board as somebody who is board caliber and who understands them and is just a good go-to, solid, trusted person, then Presenting to Boards, which is the only book I've ever written, which is written for executives. And it covers writing board papers as well as presenting them and discussing them and following up afterwards from the perspective of what boards want from you, rather than, as most of these things are written, oh, well, you've got to write. Here's how you write clearly. Here's how you do things. They're written from a technical, functional expertise, not from a board expertise. So trying to bring those two together is what that book's all about. So yes, a long answer to a short question, but read the things that you think you need at this point in your career, because nobody else is going to know better than you what you need.
And I think that was so helpful to realize that people are different places and you've got different books for different situations. And we will have links to all of those in the show notes. And Julie, the time has just flown by today. There's so many stories, and not to be unexpected when you've got multi-decades of experience working on all these different boards. And it was great to hear your transition between them and how you've built upon them and the best practice you've come up with. And I'm wondering if you have any parting advice for our audience about someone who's beginning their board career and how to go about it and make it as perhaps successful if they were trying to emulate your path.
I would say don't emulate my path, because that's 20 years out of date at the earliest bit and a few months out of date at the latest bit. But make your own path based on your own wants, needs, desires, skills, expertise, and offers. I would really strongly suggest sit down and write down, this is where I'm at with my career, this is where I want to be, these are the assets I have that have got me to where I am, these are the assets I need to develop or acquire to get me to the next step. And really think that one through. Try as much as possible to get your advice and help from people who have actually been on boards and know what they are talking about, and particularly people who are on the sorts of boards you're trying to get onto yourself, because their advice is going to be practical. There are too many, in my opinion, too many consultants out there who are telling people how to market themselves as board members, and yet the consultant has never been on a board, has no real understanding of how it feels to go to an administrator and buy a bunch of assets and call it a company and then try to lead it into something that remotely resembles success. And in the early days, trust me, that's very remote. So really get that practical, hands-on advice from people who've been there and done that, rather than the theoretical advice from consultants who make a living out of selling their advice to people like you. That would be, I think, the strongest thing. But always be authentic. Always, always. Never join a board because it's the board to join. Never be on a board with people you don't like and trust. Always follow that instinct, because that's what's going to give you, it might take longer, but that's what's going to give you the good career in the long run.
Julie, that was a tremendous amount of advice today, and thank you so much for being part of the Boardroom Bound podcast. What would be the best way for our audience to follow up with you?
The best way to follow up with me is always via email, because I travel quite a lot. I speak at international conferences. I speak in international boardrooms. So probably the best thing is email. My email, I'm very available on LinkedIn, and my email is on my profile for people who have linked to me, or you can message me through that. I'm on Facebook as well, although that's not really something I encourage people to use professionally. It's more of a social tool. I'm on Twitter, so you can find me easily there. And, of course, the other thing you can do is sign up for my newsletter so that you are reminded of my existence, and that way you will continually have my email arriving once a month into your inbox.
And we will link to your Director's Dilemma newsletter in our show notes. And Julie, we were just delighted to have you on the show today. Thank you for sharing your insights and helping all of our audience to be more boardroom bound.
Oh, you're very welcome, and I look forward to seeing all of the listeners in the right boardrooms for them fairly soon.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Julie Garland McLellan. So much knowledge to share from someone who's been on almost 20 boards over about a 20-year board career. A very successful run, and has learned so much from both taking, say, the accreditation courses, learning from some of the best in the industry, and now she's someone who shares that. She is the teacher as well as the person who's in the board, so still learning, still a student herself. She talks about she's constantly reading. Give a lot of information to all of us on the audience today, depending on where we are and where we want to focus, whether we're looking to be on a nonprofit or a government board or a paid board role, how we build on our, say, first opportunity to get a board seat or build it into a portfolio career. Julie broke all of that down and shared a lot of her personal stories about how she made that work. And she's also very clear that the reality is you have to seize the opportunities that are in front of you, but you have to be ready for them. So it was very clear in her mind that luck is about preparation meeting opportunity. She was ready when the door knocked, and then she walked right through that door. Now remember, if you head over to podcast.gordon.edu, you'll get links to all the resources we talked about today, which is quite a bit. So Julie has 6 books on the subject. She's got a monthly newsletter called The Director's Dilemma. She's got her own blog. There's lots of information that we talked about today that we'll link to. Now, the Boardroom Bound team and I are proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, promote, and empower you to land a board seat. If you enjoyed this episode, or frankly any other episode of the podcast, I'd really appreciate it if you would open up iTunes or Google Play or Stitcher or wherever you're listening to this. And if you'd take just 30 seconds to leave an honest rating and review, this would help us to get out word about the show. Now, thanks for joining me in this episode of the show. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.